Lila Hart's vision blurred as she stumbled through the white-hot desert, her cast-iron skillet dragging through sand like an anchor to a life that no longer existed. 3 days without food, 2 without water. The leather pouch of spices tied to her belt was worthless out here. You can't eat memory, can't drink hope. But when she finally collapsed in the skeleton of a town called Ash Hollow and used her last match to cook a handful of stolen beans, the smell didn't just keep her alive. It summoned a ghost. And that ghost offered her one chance at salvation, or something far more dangerous. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lila's story travels. And if you believe in second chances, hit that like button and stay until the end. The sun had stopped being a presence in the sky and had become a hammer instead, beating down on the cracked earth with methodical cruelty. Lila Hart had lost track of how many hours she'd been walking. Maybe it had been days. Time moved differently when your body was eating itself from the inside out. Her boots, leather worn thin as paper, dragged through sand that glittered like broken glass. Each step sent pain lancing up through her ankles, her knees, settling deep in her hips like rust in old iron. The cast-iron skillet tied to her belt swung with her gait, a 10-pound promise she refused to abandon. It had been her mother's, before that, her grandmother's. The handle was smooth from generations of hands, and there were scorch marks on the bottom that told stories Lila had never learned. She'd sold everything else: the wagon, the mule, her father's pocket watch, her sister's wedding ring, but not the skillet, and not the small leather pouch that hung beside it, filled with spices her mother had measured and mixed the week before the fever took her. Cinnamon, cumin, paprika, thyme. Lila whispered the names like a prayer, though she'd stopped believing in prayer the day she buried her family in shallow graves outside Amarillo. Ahead, something shimmered in the heat. Not water. She'd learned to stop hoping for water. Structures. Low, crumbling shapes that might have been buildings once. A town, or what was left of one. She aimed herself toward it like an arrow toward a target she couldn't see clearly, each breath scraping her throat raw. Her lips had split days ago. When she licked them, she tasted copper. The town materialized slowly, reluctantly, as if the desert didn't want to give it up. No name on any sign she could see, just a scatter of sun-bleached wood and buildings that leaned into each other like dying men. No smoke, no movement, no sound except the wind sliding through broken windows. Ash Hollow, someone had called it once. Or maybe she'd dreamed that. Lila dragged herself down what might have been a main street, past a collapsed general store, a saloon with no door, a church missing its roof. She found a water trough in front of a long abandoned livery, bone dry, not even mud at the bottom. Her legs gave out. She sat hard in the dust, her back against the trough, and closed her eyes. The skillet settled into her lap, heavy and warm. For a long moment, she just breathed. In and out, the rhythm of it almost meditative. Then her stomach cramped so violently, she doubled over, gasping. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. A piece of hardtack, maybe. 2 days ago? 3? It didn't matter. She was out. Out of food, out of water, out of luck. But she still had the skillet, and she still had the spices. Lila's hand moved almost without conscious thought, reaching into her shirt pocket where she'd tucked a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside, a handful of dried beans. Maybe 20, maybe less. She'd been rationing them for a week, telling herself she'd find work, find food, find something before they ran out. She'd been wrong, but 20 beans were something, and she had the skillet. And there was wood, plenty of wood from the broken buildings around her. Lila pushed herself upright, her vision swimming. She gathered scraps of timber, arranged them in a small pile in the middle of the street, and built a fire with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her last 3 matches. She used 2 before one caught. The flame was small and brave and beautiful. She set the skillet over it, added the beans, and poured in the last few drops from her canteen, barely enough to cover the bottom. Then she reached for the leather pouch, untied it with shaking fingers, and began to add spices. Just pinches. Just enough. Cumin for warmth, paprika for color. A whisper of thyme. The beans began to simmer. The smell rose into the air like something holy. Lila sat back and watched the fire, watched the skillet, watched the way the heat made the air dance. She thought about her mother standing over a stove in their little house outside Fort Worth. She thought about Sunday dinners and the way her father would close his eyes when he took the first bite, like he was tasting more than food. She thought about how none of them had made it past that winter. The beans weren't much, they weren't enough to save her, but they were warm and they smelled like home, and that was something. She was lifting the skillet off the fire when she heard the footstep. Lila spun, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt. Except she'd sold that 3 towns ago. All she had was the hot skillet, and she raised it like a weapon, her heart slamming against her ribs. A man stood 10 feet away, half hidden in the shadow of the saloon. He was old. Not ancient, but weathered in a way that spoke of decades spent under an unforgiving sun. His hair was silver, his face lined deep as a creek bed, and his clothes hung on him like they'd been made for a bigger man. He had a pack slung over one shoulder and a walking stick in his hand, and he was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was rough, quiet. "Smelled your fire." Lila didn't lower the skillet. "There's nothing here for you." "Wasn't looking for trouble." He gestured toward the beans. "Just following my nose. Haven't smelled cooking like that in a long time." She studied him. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired. Tired and thin, and like he'd walked through the same kind of hell she had. "You alone?" she asked. "Yeah." "How long you been walking?" "Long enough." He shifted his weight, leaning on the stick. "Name's Amos Kellen." Lila didn't offer her own name. She glanced down at the skillet. The beans were still hot, still fragrant. There were maybe 10 bites there. Enough for one person, not enough for 2. But she'd been alone for so long. She sank back down beside the fire, set the skillet on a flat stone, and picked up a dented spoon from her pack. She scooped up half the beans, maybe a little more than half, and held the skillet out toward him. "Take it," she said. Amos hesitated. Then he crossed the distance between them, lowered himself to the ground with a grunt, and accepted the skillet like it was made of gold. He ate slowly, deliberately, his eyes closing after the first bite. When he was done, he handed it back to her without a word. Lila finished the rest. They sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them, the desert stretching out in every direction like an ocean of dust. "Where you headed?" Amos asked finally. "Nowhere." She wiped the skillet clean with a rag. "Just walking?" "Walking's a hard way to die." "So's stopping." He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. "You got people?" "Not anymore." "Skills?" She looked at him. "I can cook?" "I noticed." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "There's a place, north of here, maybe 2 days on foot, called Iron Mesa Ranch. Big operation, run by a man named Gabriel Cross." The name meant nothing to her. "So? So I heard they're always looking for hands, drivers, ropers, cooks. Pays decent if you can do the work. Why aren't you going there?" Amos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm too old to be useful, but you—" He glanced at the skillet in her lap. "You got something they might need." Lila turned the idea over in her mind. A ranch, work, pay. It sounded too good, which meant it probably was. But what was her alternative? Keep walking until her body gave out? "Gabriel Cross," she said. "What's he like?" Amos's expression darkened. "Hard. Fair, maybe, but hard. Lost his wife and son in a fire years back. Hasn't been the same since. Runs that ranch like a man trying to outwork his ghosts." He paused. "But if you can prove you're worth keeping, he won't throw you out. And if I can't, then you'll be walking again." Lila stared into the dying fire. She thought about the beans, about the way Amos had closed his eyes when he tasted them. She thought about the skillet in her lap and the spices in the pouch, and the fact that she was still alive when she had no right to be. "How do I get there?" she asked. Amos pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket and sketched a rough map with a piece of charcoal. "Follow the ridgeline north. You'll hit a creek after a day, dry this time of year, but you can follow the bed. Leads straight to Iron Mesa. Can't miss it." He handed her the map. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen, half full, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Jerky," he said. "Not much, but it'll get you there." Lila took the offerings, her throat tight. "Why are you helping me?" Amos stood shouldering his pack. He looked down at her with something like sadness in his eyes. "Because somebody helped me once," he said. "And I didn't deserve it either." Then he turned and walked away, his silhouette fading into the dusk. and Lila was alone again. What? She left Ash Hollow at dawn, the skillet tied to her belt, the map tucked into her shirt. The jerky lasted through the first day, the water through the second. By the time she saw the iron gate rising out of the scrubland, she was running on fumes and willpower. Iron Mesa Ranch sprawled across the valley like a kingdom, corrals and barns and bunkhouses, all built from dark timber and stone. Horses moved in the pens, sleek and powerful. Men worked in the yard, their voices carrying on the wind. And at the center of it all stood a house, 2 stories, solid as a fortress, with smoke rising from the chimney. Lila walked up the long dirt road, her boots raising dust, her body screaming with every step. The gate was open, but a man stood beside it, watching her approach. He was young, broad-shouldered, with a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "Help you?" he asked. His tone wasn't friendly. "I'm looking for work," Lila said. Her voice came out hoarse, cracked. "I can cook." The man looked her over, her torn dress, her sunburned face, the skillet hanging from her belt, and his expression didn't change. "Wait here." He disappeared into the yard. Lila stood at the gate, swaying slightly, the world tilting at the edges. She focused on breathing, in and out, in and out. When the man returned, he wasn't alone. Gabriel Cross was tall and lean, with dark hair shot through with silver and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore a clean shirt and dust-covered boots, and he moved with the kind of controlled stillness that made you think twice before speaking. He stopped a few feet from her and said nothing. Lila met his gaze. "I need work. I can cook. Can you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes? We don't take drifters." "I'm not a drifter. I'm a cook." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You got references?" "I've got this." She lifted the skillet. "And I've got 10 years of keeping people fed when there wasn't enough to go around." Gabriel studied her for a long moment. Then he glanced at the man beside him. "Test her." The man blinked. "Sir?" "You heard me. She says she can cook. Let her prove it." Gabriel's gaze returned to Lila, cold and assessing. "You've got until sundown. Feed 10 men. If they eat it, you stay. If they don't, you walk." Lila's heart pounded. "What do I have to work with?" "Whatever's in the cookhouse." He turned and walked away without another word, and the man with the rifle jerked his head toward a low building near the main house. "Come on." Lila followed, her legs trembling, her mind already racing. She'd cooked for crowds before. She'd stretched meals that shouldn't have fed 2 people into dinners for 6. She could do this. She had to. The cookhouse was dim and smelled of old grease and smoke. There was a heavy iron stove, a long wooden table, shelves lined with mismatched pots and pans. Lila moved through the space quickly, taking inventory. Flour, lard, salt, a few wrinkled potatoes, some dried meat that might have been beef, an onion, no fresh vegetables, no spices except a tin of black pepper. She closed her eyes and reached for the leather pouch at her belt. Cinnamon, cumin, paprika, thyme. She could work with this. Lila built a fire in the stove, set her skillet on the heat, and got to work. She diced the onion, fried it in lard until it softened and sweetened. Added the dried meat, rehydrated, and shredded. A pinch of cumin, a whisper of paprika. She boiled the potatoes, mashed them with more lard and a touch of pepper, and rolled out biscuit dough with a whiskey bottle because there was no rolling pin. The smell began to fill the cookhouse, rich and warm and alive. By the time the sun touched the horizon, she had a pot of thick stew and a tray of golden biscuits, and her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. The door opened. Men filed in, 10 of them, just like Gabriel had said. They were dusty and tired and skeptical, and they sat down at the table without speaking. Gabriel entered last, taking a seat at the head. Lila served them in silence, ladling stew into bowls, setting biscuits on plates. The first man took a bite, then another. He didn't look up. The second man tore into a biscuit, soaking it in the stew. His expression didn't change, but he kept eating. One by one, the men cleaned their bowls. No one spoke. No one complained. Gabriel ate slowly, his face unreadable. When he was done, he set down his spoon and looked at her. "You'll sleep in the small room off the cookhouse," he said. "Breakfast is at 5. Don't be late." Then he stood and walked out, and the men followed, and Lila was alone in the cookhouse with 10 empty bowls and the smell of her mother's spices still hanging in the air. She sank into a chair, her body finally giving up, and closed her eyes. She'd done it. She had a place to sleep, a place to work. She had a chance, and for the first time in months, Lila Hart let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. The small room off the cookhouse had a cot, a wooden crate that served as a table, and a single window that looked out onto the yard. Lila collapsed onto the cot, still wearing her boots, the cast iron skillet beside her like a talisman, and fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. She woke to darkness and the sound of roosters, her body screaming in protest as she pushed herself upright. Every muscle ached, her hands were blistered from the day before, her feet swollen inside her boots. But when she struck a match and lit the lamp, the clock on the wall read 4:30, and Gabriel Cross had said breakfast at 5. She moved through the cookhouse like a ghost, building the fire, setting water to boil, pulling out flour and lard and the last of the eggs she'd found in the cold box. Her hands worked on instinct, measuring and mixing while her mind stayed half asleep. Biscuits again. She'd need to find something else soon or the men would tire of them. And a pan of scrambled eggs stretched with milk and seasoned with the last pinch of thyme from her pouch. The men arrived exactly at 5, filing in without greeting her, taking their seats at the long table like this was a ritual they'd performed 1,000 times. Gabriel sat at the head again, his face as unreadable as stone. Lila served them in silence. They ate in silence. When they were done, they left without a word, and she was alone with the dirty dishes and the growing realization that this was her life now. She spent the morning scrubbing pots and planning meals in her head, taking inventory of what little remained in the pantry. Dried beans, more flour, some bacon that was more fat than meat, a jar of molasses. It wasn't much to work with, but she'd worked with less. Around midday, she stepped outside for the first time since waking, squinting against the harsh sunlight. The ranch yard was alive with activity, men working horses in the corral, others repairing fence posts, a wagon being loaded with supplies. No one looked at her. It was like she didn't exist. She was about to retreat back into the cookhouse when she noticed something on the step, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Lila glanced around, but no one was watching. She picked up the bundle and unwrapped it carefully. Inside, a handful of wild onions, their roots still trailing dirt, and 3 carrots, small and misshapen but fresh. Her throat tightened. Someone had left this for her. Someone had thought about what she might need. She looked across the yard again, searching for any sign of who it might have been, but the men worked on, oblivious. Lila carried the vegetables inside, washed them carefully, and added them to her mental inventory like they were gold. That evening, she made a soup, thin but honest, with the wild onions and carrots lending sweetness to the broth, the last of the bacon providing salt and fat. She thickened it with flour and served it with more biscuits, and again the men ate without comment. But this time, one of them, a younger man with sun-bleached hair and a scar across his jaw, met her eyes as he handed back his bowl. "Good," he said. Just that one word. Then he was gone. It was something. The next morning, there was another bundle on the step. This time, mushrooms. Fat and meaty, the kind that grew in shaded places, and a small bunch of sage. Lila's hands shook as she picked them up. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the yard, the barn, the bunkhouse. Nothing. No one. But someone was watching her. Someone was helping her. She used the mushrooms that night, sautéing them with the sage until the cookhouse smelled like a forest after rain, then folding them into a gravy that she poured over boiled potatoes. The men ate with more appetite than they had before. Gabriel said nothing, but she caught him glancing at his empty plate with something that might have been approval. On the 4th morning, the bundle contained wild herbs she didn't recognize and a note written in careful blocky letters, for the beans. Lila stared at the note for a long time. She didn't know who her silent benefactor was, but they understood food. They understood what she was trying to do. That afternoon, she was carrying water from the well when she saw him. He was standing near the horse barn, half hidden in shadow, watching her with dark, careful eyes. He was younger than most of the other hands, maybe 30, with black hair that fell past his shoulders, and a face that could have been carved from the same stone as the mountains. He wore a leather vest over a plain shirt, and his hands rested on the halter of a dappled gray horse that stood quietly beside him. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. Lila set down the bucket and walked toward him, her heart beating faster. As she got closer, she saw the way he held himself, very still, very controlled, like a man used to being invisible. "Was it you?" she asked. "The vegetables, the herbs." He didn't answer, didn't nod. But something in his expression shifted, and she knew. "Thank you," she said. "They've helped, more than you know." He watched her for another moment, then turned his attention back to the horse, running his hand along its neck in a gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He wrote something and handed it to her. "Mateo Rea did." Lila looked up from the note. "You can't speak?" He shook his head. "But you can hear me." He nodded. She smiled, small, tentative. "Well, Mateo Reyes, I'm Lila Hart, and I owe you a decent meal." His mouth quirked at the corner, not quite a smile, but close. From that day forward, the gifts continued. Never food that would be missed from the main stores, always things foraged from the land around the ranch. Wild greens, birds' eggs. Once, a rabbit already cleaned and skinned. Mateo never approached her directly, never spoke through his notes unless necessary, but she began to see him more often. Working with the horses, mending tack, always moving with that same quiet grace, like he was part of the landscape itself. The other men treated him with a kind of distant respect. He wasn't one of them, not quite, but he was skilled enough that they didn't question his presence. Lila learned from overheard conversations that he'd come to the ranch 2 years ago, that he was the best horseman Gabriel had ever employed, and that no one knew where he'd come from or why he didn't speak. She didn't pry. She understood the need to keep certain things buried, but she made sure his portions were always a little larger, and when she caught his eye across the yard, she nodded her thanks. 3 weeks into her tenure at Iron Mesa, Gabriel summoned her to the main house. Lila had never been inside before. She climbed the wide steps to the porch, knocked on the heavy wooden door, and waited with her heart in her throat. "Come in." The interior was spare and clean, hardwood floors, simple furniture, everything functional and built to last. Gabriel stood near the fireplace, a ledger open on the table beside him. "Close the door," he said. She did. He studied her for a moment, his pale eyes giving nothing away. "The men are eating better than they have in months." Lila said nothing. She didn't know if this was praise or the preamble to dismissal. "You're not wasting supplies. You're working with what you have." He paused. "That's rare." "I've had practice," she said quietly. "I can tell." He closed the ledger. "How much am I paying you?" Lila blinked. "You haven't said." "No, I haven't." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the table between them. "Room, board, and $20 a month. That's standard for a cook. You prove you're worth more, we'll talk." $20. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than she'd had in a year. "Thank you," she said. Gabriel nodded once. "One more thing. My aunt is coming to visit. Ruth Cross. She'll be here tomorrow." Something in his tone made Lila's stomach tighten. "Is there something I should know?" "Ruth has opinions about how things should be run. She'll have opinions about you." His expression didn't change, but there was a warning in his voice. "Don't let her push you around." Lila met his gaze. "I won't." "Good." He turned back to the ledger, a clear dismissal. "That's all." She left the house with the pouch of coins tucked into her apron, her mind already racing. Gabriel's aunt, opinions. She'd dealt with difficult people before, people who thought a woman alone was fair game for judgment, or worse. She could handle one more. But when Ruth Cross arrived the next afternoon, stepping down from a polished carriage with the bearing of a queen surveying conquered territory, Lila realized she might have underestimated the situation. Ruth was tall and angular, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes like chips of flint. She wore black, full morning dress, even in the heat, and she moved through the ranch yard with the kind of authority that made men step aside without thinking. Lila was peeling potatoes in the cookhouse when the door swung open and Ruth walked in without knocking. "So you're the new cook," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Lila set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, ma'am." Lila Hart. Ruth's gaze swept over her, taking in the worn dress, the sunburned face, the calloused hands. "Where are you from?" "Texas." "Family?" "Dead." Ruth's expression didn't soften. "You came here alone?" "Yes." "Convenient." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Lila felt her spine stiffen. "I came here looking for work. Your nephew gave me a chance, that's all." "My nephew," Ruth said slowly, has a habit of taking in strays. It's a weakness. Maybe it's a strength. Ruth's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer and Lila caught the scent of lavender and something sharper. Grief. Maybe, or just old anger. You don't know anything about this family, about what we've lost, so don't presume to tell me what's strong and what's weak. Lila held her ground. You're right. I don't know your history, but I know how to cook, and I know how to work, and I'm not here to cause trouble. Ruth stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to the stove, lifting the lid off the pot that was simmering there. Steam rose, carrying the scent of beans and bacon and the wild herbs Mateo had brought her. Ruth went very still. What is this? Her voice had changed, gone quiet, almost fragile. Bean stew, Lila said carefully, with sage and thyme. Ruth replaced the lid with hands that trembled just slightly. When she turned back to Lila, her face was a mask, but something had cracked behind her eyes. My sister used to make something like this, Ruth said, before she died. Lila's breath caught. Gabriel's wife. The woman who'd burned. I didn't know, she said softly. Of course you didn't. Ruth's voice hardened again, the crack sealing over. But you'll understand why I won't be eating in the cookhouse while I'm here. She walked out, leaving the door open behind her, and Lila stood alone in the sudden silence, her hands still shaking. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot in her small room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Ruth's face when she'd smelled the stew, thinking about Gabriel's warning, thinking about how grief could turn a person into something sharp and unyielding. Around midnight, she heard footsteps outside. Lila sat up, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped near her window. Then came a soft sound, something being set down carefully. She waited until the footsteps retreated before slipping out of bed and opening the door. On the step, a small crate filled with vegetables she'd never seen on the ranch before. Fresh tomatoes, green beans, a head of cabbage. And tucked among them, a note in Mateo's careful handwriting. From the garden past the ridge. Lila crouched down, running her fingers over the tomatoes, and felt tears prick at her eyes. Mateo was risking something, time maybe, or trouble, to bring her these things, to make her job easier, to help her survive. She didn't know why. She didn't know what she'd done to deserve it. But the next morning, she made a sauce from the tomatoes that turned the breakfast eggs into something close to magic. And when the men ate, they didn't just clean their plates, they asked for seconds. Gabriel said nothing, but when he left, he met her eyes for the briefest moment, and she saw something there that might have been gratitude. Ruth stayed at the ranch for a week, taking her meals in the main house, never setting foot in the cookhouse again. But Lila sometimes caught her standing at a distance, watching through the window, her face expressionless. On the last day of Ruth's visit, Lila was kneading bread dough when the cookhouse door opened. She looked up, expecting one of the men, and froze. Ruth stood in the doorway, a bundle in her arms. I'm leaving tomorrow, Ruth said. Her voice was formal, controlled. Before I go, I wanted to give you this. She set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it. Inside, a heavy woolen shawl, deep green and beautiful, and beneath it, a small leather-bound book. Lila stared. I don't understand. The shawl was my sister's, Margaret, Gabriel's wife. Ruth's voice didn't waver, but her hands did. She would have wanted someone to use it, someone who... She trailed off, then started again. The book contains her recipes. I thought you might find them useful. Lila reached out slowly, reverently, and touched the soft wool of the shawl. Mrs. Cross, I can't. You can, and you will. Ruth's eyes were fierce now. Because if you're going to stay here, if you're going to feed these men with food that smells like memory, then you should at least understand what you're conjuring. I'm sorry, Lila said quietly, for your loss. Ruth's jaw tightened. For a moment, Lila thought she might leave without another word, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She died because Gabriel couldn't save her, and he spent every day since trying to burn that failure out of himself with work. Ruth met Lila's gaze. You seem like a decent woman, Miss Hart. Don't let this place destroy you the way it's destroying him. Then she turned and walked out, and Lila was left standing in the cookhouse with a dead woman's shawl and a book full of recipes written in a delicate, careful hand. That night, she opened the book and read by lamplight. Margaret Cross had been methodical, noting not just ingredients and techniques, but small observations. Gabriel prefers less salt. Use the rosemary from the East Garden. This one reminds him of his mother. Lila traced the words with her finger, feeling the weight of a life she'd never known, a love she'd never witnessed. And she understood suddenly why Ruth had been so harsh, why Gabriel was so cold, why this ranch felt less like a home and more like a monument to people who were gone. She closed the book and set it beside her cot, next to the cast iron skillet. 2 days later, she used one of Margaret's recipes, a roast with carrots and potatoes, seasoned simply, and served it for Sunday dinner. The men ate quietly, but with more attention than usual, and when Gabriel tasted it, he went very still. He didn't say anything, but his hand tightened around his fork, and he didn't look up for the rest of the meal. Lila watched him from across the room and thought about what Ruth had said, about failure and grief, and the ways people tried to survive the unsurvivable. When the meal was over and the men had gone, Gabriel lingered. He stood near the door, his back to her, silent. "That was my wife's recipe," he said finally. "I know. Your aunt gave me her book." He turned, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something unguarded in his face, something raw. Why would she do that? "I think," Lila said carefully, "because she wants you to remember her as more than the way she died." Gabriel's jaw worked. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe argue, maybe thank her, but in the end, he just nodded once and walked out into the night. Lila cleaned the kitchen in silence, her hands moving automatically, her mind elsewhere. She thought about Mateo's gifts, about Ruth's shawl, about the way Gabriel had looked when he tasted his wife's recipe. She was starting to understand the shape of this place, the weight it carried, the ghosts that haunted it. And she realized, standing alone in the cookhouse with the lamp burning low, that she was becoming part of it. That these people, broken and grieving and trying so hard to survive, were letting her in, piece by piece. She didn't know if that was a gift or a burden, but she knew she wasn't walking away. The weeks that followed Ruth's departure settled into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Lila woke before dawn, built the fire, cooked 3 meals a day for men who were starting to nod at her when they arrived and sometimes even mutter thanks when they left. The work was relentless. Her hands never fully healed from the burns and cuts and constant scrubbing, but it was honest work. It was hers. Mateo's gifts continued. Sometimes it was food, wild asparagus, chanterelles, once a string of trout already gutted and cleaned. Other times it was small repairs she hadn't asked for. A loose hinge on the cookhouse door fixed, a crack in the window sealed with careful strips of leather, a new knife sharpened to a razor edge and left on her cutting board without explanation. She tried to thank him directly once, catching him near the water trough as he led a chestnut mare toward the barn. He'd looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and shaken his head slightly, pressing a finger to his lips. Not silence, privacy. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want the other men to know. Lila understood that kind of caution. She'd lived it herself for long enough. So instead, she made sure his meals were worth the effort. Extra biscuits wrapped in cloth and left near the tack room. A jar of the molasses she'd been hoarding set on the fence post by the corral. Once, a slice of apple pie made from dried fruit she'd reconstituted in whiskey. Contraband from the main house that Gabriel pretended not to notice was missing. It was a strange kind of friendship, built entirely in gestures and silence, but it was real. And in a place like Iron Mesa, where words were used sparingly, and trust even more so, it mattered. Gabriel remained distant but fair. He checked in once a week, asking about supplies and whether she needed anything from town. He never stayed long, never made small talk, but Lila had learned to read the small shifts in his expression, the slight relaxation around his eyes when a meal was particularly good, the tightness in his jaw when something reminded him of Margaret. She used the recipe book carefully, spacing out Margaret's dishes so they didn't become routine. But every few weeks she'd make something from those pages, and every time Gabriel would go still and silent, eating slowly, and then leave without a word. It was the middle of summer when the merchant came. Lila was in the yard, beating dust from a tablecloth, when she heard the rattle of a wagon. A man in a worn suit and a battered hat pulled up near the main house, his cart loaded with crates and barrels. She recognized him vaguely. He made the rounds to the outlying ranches, selling supplies and carrying mail. "Delivery for Iron Mesa," he called out, hopping down. "Gabriel Cross around?" One of the hands pointed toward the barn, and the merchant nodded. But before he headed that way, his gaze swept the yard and landed on Lila. "You the cook?" he asked. "I am." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. "Got something for you. Came through the postal station in Silver Creek. Took him a while to track down where you'd ended up." Lila's heart stuttered. She crossed the yard slowly, took the package from his hands, and stared down at her name written in a script she didn't recognize. "Thank you," she managed. The merchant tipped his hat and went to find Gabriel, leaving Lila standing alone with the package pressed against her chest. She carried it back to the cookhouse, set it on the small table in her room, and just looked at it for a long time. She hadn't gotten mail in more than a year, hadn't expected to ever get mail again. Everyone she'd known was dead or lost or had moved on without her. Finally, she untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a letter and something wrapped in cloth. Lila unfolded the letter first, her hands shaking. The handwriting was careful and old-fashioned, the ink slightly faded. "Miss Lila Hart, I hope this finds you well. My name is Esther Brennan. You don't know me, but I knew your mother, Clara. We grew up together in Missouri before she married your father and moved west. I heard about what happened to your family, and I've been trying to find you ever since. I wanted you to have this. Your mother sent it to me years ago when you were just a girl, asking me to keep it safe. She said it was for you when you were old enough to understand it. I think now is that time. May it bring you comfort. With sympathy and hope, Esther Brennan." Lila's vision blurred. She set the letter down and unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers. Inside was a small leather journal, the cover worn soft with age. She opened it carefully and saw her mother's handwriting, looser than Margaret's, more hurried, but achingly familiar. The first page read, "For Lila, my recipes, my thoughts, my love. So you'll always have a piece of home." Lila pressed the journal to her chest and sobbed. Great gasping sobs that shook her whole body, years of grief finally breaking through the dam she'd built to survive. She cried for her mother, for her father, for her sister, and the life they should have had. She cried for the girl she'd been before the fever came, and for the woman she'd become in the aftermath. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollow and exhausted and strangely lighter. She wiped her face with her sleeve, took a shaky breath, and opened the journal again. The recipes were there, dozens of them, written in her mother's voice, with little notes in the margins. "Your father loves this one. Make sure the oven's hot enough or it'll be tough. This is what my mother taught me, and now I teach you." But interspersed with the recipes were other entries, thoughts about life and love and the hard work of making a home in a place that didn't want to be tamed. Stories about Lila as a child, the time she'd tried to cook on her own and nearly burned down the kitchen, the way she'd always insisted on stirring the pot even when she was too small to reach. It was a map of a life. Her life. A life that had existed before the death and the walking and the desperate scramble just to survive. Lila read until the light faded, then lit a lamp and kept reading. She didn't emerge from her room until the next morning, and when she did, her eyes were swollen, but her hands were steady. That day, she cooked from her mother's journal. A stew that Clara Hart had learned from her own mother, rich with beef and root vegetables, and a hint of cinnamon that made it taste like autumn. She made it exactly as the recipe instructed, and when the men ate it that evening, she watched their faces and thought about continuity, about how food could carry memory across distance and time. Gabriel ate slowly, as he always did with the special meals, but this time, when he finished, he looked at her directly. "That's different from Margaret's cooking," he said. "It's my mother's." He nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. "It's good. Thank you." He stood to leave, then paused. "You're settling in here?" It wasn't quite a question, but Lila answered anyway. "Yes." "Good," he said, and then, almost too quiet to hear, "We need that." After he left, Lila sat in the empty cookhouse and let herself feel the weight of those words. We need that. Not just food, not just someone to cook, but someone who was settling in, someone who might stay. The next morning, she found something new on her step. Not food this time, but a small terracotta pot with a seedling growing in dark, rich soil. The leaves were distinctive, pointed and slightly fuzzy. A chili plant. Lila picked it up carefully and found Mateo standing near the horse barn, watching. She held up the pot, a question in her eyes. He walked over slowly, pulled out his notepad, and wrote, You can plant it by the cookhouse. Will grow all summer." She looked down at the little plant, then back at him. "Where did you get this?" He wrote again. "Carried the seeds from home. Saved them." "Where's home?" He hesitated, then wrote one word. "Gone." Lila understood that too. She set the pot down carefully and met his eyes. "Thank you, Mateo, for everything." He nodded once, then turned back to his work, and Lila carried the chili plant to a spot beside the cookhouse where it would get sun. She dug a small hole with a kitchen spoon, settled the plant into the earth, and patted the soil around its roots. It felt like a promise, like putting down roots of her own. The summer heat intensified, turning the ranch into a furnace during the day and offering only slight relief at night. The men worked longer hours during the cooler mornings and evenings, and Lila adjusted the meal schedule accordingly. Breakfast before dawn. A cold lunch they could eat in the fields. Dinner after sunset when they'd finally dragged themselves back. She learned their preferences without asking. The young man with the scar, his name was Clay, liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint. An older hand named Benson avoided onions. A quiet man called Walker always took seconds on bread, but never on meat. And Mateo. Mateo ate everything she made with the same quiet appreciation, always cleaning his plate, always nodding his thanks. But it was Gabriel who surprised her. Late one evening, after the men had gone and she was washing the last of the dishes, he appeared in the cookhouse doorway. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Lila dried her hands on her apron. "Of course." He stepped inside, looking uncomfortable in a way she'd never seen before. He stood near the stove, his hands in his pockets, and seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "My aunt wrote to me," he said finally, after she got home. Lila waited. "She said I should tell you what happened, with Margaret and my son." He paused, his jaw working. "She seems to think you have a right to know." "You don't owe me anything," Lila said quietly. "Maybe not, but Ruth's usually right about these things, even when I don't want her to be." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, like the weight of what he was about to say was too much to carry standing. "It was 5 years ago, late autumn. I'd gone into town for supplies, took 2 of the men with me. Margaret and our boy, Samuel, he was 6. They were here at the ranch." He stopped, and Lila could see the muscles in his throat working. "There was a fire. Started in the barn, we think from a lamp that got knocked over. Spread fast. Margaret got Samuel out of the house, but the barn was already engulfed, and 3 horses were trapped inside. She went in after them." Lila's breath caught. "By the time I got back, the barn was gone. Samuel was with one of the hands, safe, but Margaret—" He closed his eyes. "She'd gotten 2 of the horses out. The 3rd one panicked, knocked her down. By the time the men got to her, the smoke had already—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "I'm so sorry," Lila said. Gabriel shook his head. "I should have been here. Should have been the one to go in. Instead, I was in town buying feed and whiskey, and my wife died trying to do what I should have done." "You can't know that you would have saved her." "No, but I know I wasn't here to try." He opened his eyes and looked at her directly. "That's what Ruth wanted you to understand. Why I am the way I am. Why I run this place like I'm at war with it. Because I am." Lila sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. "And Samuel?" Pain flashed across Gabriel's face. "Samuel died 3 months later. Fever. He'd never been strong, and losing his mother—" He stopped again, swallowing hard. "I couldn't save either of them, so I work. Because if I stop, I'll have to think about that." The silence that followed was heavy and profound. Lila thought about her own losses, about the way grief could either destroy you or turn you into something harder and sharper. About how Gabriel had chosen to survive by building walls and working himself to exhaustion. "You know what my mother used to say?" Lila asked softly. Gabriel looked at her. "She said that the dead don't want us to stop living. They want us to carry them forward, to take what they gave us and make something with it." She paused. "Margaret left you her recipes. That's not nothing. That's her telling you to keep feeding people, keep making a home, even if she can't be here to do it with you." Gabriel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what was the point of my family dying? What's the point of me still being here?" He nodded slowly, and something in his face shifted, not quite softening, but opening slightly. "Ruth was right. You do have a right to know. He stood, pushed the chair back under the table, and headed for the door. But before he left, he turned back. Thank you, he said. For the food, for staying, for... He gestured vaguely, as if the rest was too complicated to articulate. You're welcome, Lila said. After he left, she sat alone in the cookhouse for a long time, thinking about Margaret running into a burning barn to save horses, thinking about Gabriel carrying that failure like a stone around his neck, thinking about how this ranch was built on loss and held together by sheer stubborn will. And she understood, finally, why her cooking mattered so much. It wasn't just about feeding bodies. It was about feeding souls, about creating warmth in a place that had gone cold, about reminding people that life could still be good, even after everything had gone wrong. The next week, a summer storm rolled in, one of those violent, short-lived tempests that turned the sky black and hammered the earth with rain and hail. The men took shelter in the bunkhouse and the barn, and Lila stood in the cookhouse doorway, watching the water pour down. The storm broke just before sunset, leaving the air clean and cool and the ground steaming. Lila was preparing dinner when Clay burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. Miss Hart, you need to come see this. She followed him outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Several of the men were gathered near the cookhouse, pointing at something on the ground. Her chili plant. The little seedling Mateo had given her had survived the storm, and somehow, impossibly, it had tripled in size overnight, its roots drinking deep from the rain-soaked earth. Small white flowers were already beginning to form at the tips of the branches. Damn thing's thriving, Benson said, shaking his head. Never seen a plant grow that fast. Lila knelt beside it, touching one of the leaves gently. It was strong and healthy, its stem thick with life. She looked up and saw Mateo standing at the edge of the group, his expression unreadable, but his eyes warm. He'd given her something that could grow, something that could survive. And watching it now, strong and vital despite the storm, felt like a message she didn't quite know how to interpret. That night, she cooked with extra care. A celebration of survival, though she didn't say that out loud. She made a pot roast from Margaret's book, tender and rich, with the last of the carrots and potatoes. And she made biscuits from her mother's journal, the kind Clara Hart had called Sunday biscuits, because they were too good for regular days. The men ate like they were starving, which in a way they were. Starving for comfort, for something that felt like home. And when Gabriel took his first bite of the biscuit, he closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, and Lila saw a crack in his armor that hadn't been there before. "Where'd you learn this recipe?" he asked. "My mother." He nodded, chewing slowly. "She taught you well." "She taught me that food is more than food. It's connection, it's memory. It's how we tell people we care about them when we don't have the words." Gabriel set down his fork and looked at her directly. "You're good at that." So was she. After dinner, after the men had gone and the cookhouse was clean, Lila stepped outside to check on the chili plant one more time. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the yard, and the air smelled like wet earth and possibility. She heard footsteps and turned to find Mateo approaching. He stopped a few feet away, his notepad already in hand. "It will give you peppers soon," he wrote. "Enough to share." Lila smiled. "I'll make something special with them. A thank you." He shook his head and wrote again. "No need to thank me. You make this place better." The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked up at him, this quiet man who'd been leaving gifts on her doorstep for months, who'd never asked for anything in return, and felt something shift in her chest. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you help me?" Mateo hesitated, then wrote slowly, carefully. "Because you remind me that good things still exist." Lila's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to respond to such raw honesty. So instead, she reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude and understanding, and he nodded once before turning and walking back toward the barn. Lila stood alone in the moonlight, her hand still warm from the brief contact, and looked up at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. She thought about Margaret running into fire, about Gabriel trying to outrun his grief, about Mateo carrying seeds from a home he'd lost, about Ruth giving away her sister's shawl, about her mother writing recipes in a journal meant to survive her. And she thought about herself, a woman who'd walked through the desert with nothing but a skillet and a dream of survival, who'd somehow found her way to this broken place and started putting down roots. Iron Mesa wasn't healed. Maybe it never would be. But it was healing, one meal at a time, one gift at a time, one small act of kindness in a hard world. And Lila Hart, who'd spent so long just trying to survive, was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, she was learning how to live again. The chili plant bore fruit in mid-August, small green peppers that ripened to brilliant red under the relentless sun. Lila picked them carefully, feeling the weight of Mateo's gift in her hands, and that evening she made something she hadn't attempted since leaving Texas, her mother's recipe for chili Colorado, a dish that required patience and precision and peppers with enough heat to make grown men weep. She roasted the chilies over the open flame until their skins blistered and blackened, then peeled them with careful fingers, her eyes watering from the capsaicin. The smell filled the cookhouse, earthy and bright and alive, and she thought about her mother standing at a stove just like this one, teaching her daughter that the best food came from taking time, from refusing to rush. The men ate dinner that night with a kind of reverent silence. Clay took his first bite, went very still, then reached for his water glass. Benson ate slowly, deliberately, his weathered face flushing slightly. Walker cleaned his bowl and asked for seconds before he'd even swallowed his last bite. Gabriel ate without speaking, but she saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his breathing slowed. When he was done, he set down his spoon and looked at her. "That's the best meal I've had in 5 years," he said. It wasn't effusive. It wasn't flowery. But coming from Gabriel Cross, it meant everything. Mateo was the last to finish. He caught her eye across the room and touched his chest briefly, then his temple, a gesture that needed no translation. Heart and mind. "Thank you." Lila nodded, her throat too tight for words. After the men left, she sat alone at the long table, exhausted and satisfied and feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not just survival, purpose, the sense that what she was doing mattered to people beyond herself. She was cleaning the last pot when Gabriel returned. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the rising moon, and for a moment he just watched her work. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Lila set down the pot. "All right." He came inside, pulled out a chair, and sat down with the careful movements of a man carrying a heavy burden. "The merchant who brought your package. He had news from Silver Creek. There's talk of trouble coming." "What kind of trouble?" "Range war. Cattlemen fighting over water rights, fence cutters causing problems, some of the smaller ranchers getting squeezed out by the big operations." He paused. "Iron Mesa's been neutral so far, but that won't last. Eventually, people will have to choose sides." "What side are you on?" "The side that keeps this ranch running and my people safe." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "But I'm telling you this because if things get bad, the ranch might not be safe, especially for someone who doesn't have ties here. Someone who could still leave." Lila looked at him carefully. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No, I'm giving you the option before you don't have one anymore." She thought about that, about the cast iron skillet still sitting on the shelf in her room, about her mother's journal and Margaret's recipe book, about the chili plant growing outside and Mateo's quiet gifts and the way the men had started nodding at her in the yard. "I'm not leaving," she said. Gabriel studied her face. "You're sure?" "I walked through the desert with nothing. I survived things that should have killed me. I'm not afraid of trouble, Mr. Cross. I've already lived through worse." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. "All right then. But I need you to understand something. If fighting comes here, every person on this ranch will have to pull their weight. That includes you." "I understand." "Good." He stood, then paused. "There's one more thing. The merchant also brought word that there's a cattle drive passing through next week. 40 men, maybe more. They'll need a place to camp and a hot meal. I told him we could accommodate them for a price." Lila's mind immediately started calculating. 40 men, one meal. She'd need help. She'd need supplies. She'd need... "I know it's a lot to ask," Gabriel continued, "but the money's good, and it would help us stock up before winter. I'll give you whatever you need. Extra hands, more supplies, whatever it takes." She met his eyes. "I can do it." "You sure?" "I made 10 men eat my cooking on my first day here with nothing but scraps and a prayer. I can handle 40. This time, Gabriel did smile, small and brief, but real. "I believe you can." He left, and Lila stood alone in the cookhouse, her mind already racing through possibilities. 40 men. She'd need to make something that could feed a crowd without requiring constant attention. Something hearty and filling that wouldn't lose quality sitting in a pot. Something that would make those drovers remember Iron Mesa. She pulled out both recipe books, her mother's and Margaret's, and started reading by lamplight, making notes in the margins of a scrap of paper. By the time she finally went to bed, she had a plan. The next morning, she found Gabriel before breakfast and handed him a list. "I'll need all of this from town," she said, "and I'll need help. At least 2 people to assist with prep and serving." Gabriel scanned the list, his eyebrows rising slightly at the quantities. "This is a lot of beef. 40 men eat a lot of beef." "Fair point." He folded the list and tucked it into his pocket. "I'll send Clay and Benson into Silver Creek today. As for help, I can spare Walker and—" He hesitated. "Mateo's good with his hands. He could help with prep work." Lila's heart skipped slightly. "That would be fine." Gabriel gave her a knowing look but said nothing. He left to organize the supply run, and Lila went back to the cookhouse to start planning in earnest. The supplies arrived 2 days later. Sacks of flour and cornmeal, slabs of beef wrapped in cloth, onions and potatoes and dried beans, and a precious jar of honey that Gabriel had added to the order without her asking. She spent the next 3 days preparing what could be made ahead. Biscuit dough wrapped and stored in the cold box, beans soaking in huge pots, spice mixtures measured and ready. Walker proved to be steady and uncomplaining, following her instructions without question. But it was Mateo who surprised her. He appeared in the cookhouse the day before the cattle drive was due to arrive, rolled up his sleeves, and went to work without needing to be told what to do. He peeled potatoes with quick, efficient movements, his knife flashing in the lamplight. He chopped onions with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. And when she needed something from a high shelf or a pot moved from the stove, he was there before she could ask. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of their movements synchronizing naturally. Once, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same knife, and Mateo pulled back quickly, his eyes apologetic. "It's all right," Lila said softly. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and went back to work. By sunset, they'd prepared enough food to feed a small army. Lila stood in the middle of the cookhouse, surveying the pots and pans and trays, and felt a fierce pride rising in her chest. "We did good work today," she said. Mateo pulled out his notepad and wrote, "You do good work every day." Lila felt heat rising in her cheeks. "You're too kind." He shook his head and wrote again, "Not kind, honest." Before she could respond, Walker stuck his head through the door. "Boss says the drovers will be here by noon tomorrow. Wants to know if you're ready." "Tell him yes," Lila said. That night, she barely slept. She went over the plan again and again in her mind, checking for weaknesses, for things she might have forgotten. When she finally did drift off, she dreamed of her mother standing at a stove, stirring a pot with slow, deliberate movements, and saying, "The secret isn't in the recipe, Lila. It's in the care you put into it." The cattle drive arrived exactly at noon, a long stream of men and horses and bawling cattle that turned the ranch yard into controlled chaos. The trail boss, a lean man with a gray beard and eyes like chips of ice, dismounted and shook Gabriel's hand. "Appreciate the hospitality, Cross," he said. "My men need a hot meal and a night's rest before we push on to Billings." "You'll get both," Gabriel said. "Cookhouse is ready when you are." The drovers settled the cattle in a temporary pen, then lined up outside the cookhouse like soldiers awaiting orders. Leela stood inside, her heart pounding, and nodded to Mateo and Walker. "Let's feed them," she said. The meal was simple but substantial. Beef stew thick with vegetables and rich with the drippings she'd saved from roasting, cornbread made with honey and butter, and strong coffee that could wake the dead. She served it in waves, keeping the pots full and hot, moving through the cookhouse with practiced efficiency. The drovers ate like they'd been starving, and maybe they had been, subsisting on hardtack and jerky for weeks on the trail. They didn't talk much, too focused on the food, but she heard the occasional grunt of satisfaction, the scrape of spoons against bowls, the requests for seconds and thirds. The trail boss ate last, taking his time, and when he was done he found Lila near the stove. "Ma'am, that's the best trail meal I've had in 20 years of driving cattle. You've got a gift." "Thank you," Lila said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Cross is lucky to have you." He tipped his hat and headed back outside, and Lila allowed herself a moment of pure, unfiltered relief. They'd done it. 40 men fed without a single complaint. The cookhouse was a disaster. Dirty dishes stacked everywhere, pots crusted with food, the floor tracked with mud. But they'd done it. Mateo appeared beside her with a basin of clean water and a rag. He didn't write anything, just started cleaning, and Lila joined him without a word. They worked side by side as the sun set and the cookhouse slowly returned to order, and when they were finally done, Walker had already gone to bed, and they were alone. Lila sat down heavily on a bench, her body aching in ways she'd almost forgotten were possible. Mateo sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." He pulled out his notepad, hesitated, then wrote, "I would do anything for you." Lila's breath caught. She looked at him, at his dark eyes and serious expression, and understood that he wasn't just talking about cooking. "Mateo," she started, but didn't know how to finish. He touched her hand briefly, just his fingertips against her knuckles, feather light, and then stood and walked out into the night, leaving her sitting alone with her heart racing and her mind spinning. She sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Mateo had been kind to her from the beginning, had helped her without asking for anything in return, but this felt like something more, something deeper, and she didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, the drovers left early, the trail boss pressing a stack of bills into Gabriel's hand and thanking him again for the hospitality. Gabriel counted the money, then handed half of it to Lila. "Your share," he said. "You earned it." Lila stared at the bills. It was more money than she'd seen in years. Enough to buy supplies, to save, to have a cushion against disaster. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. You did the work." He paused. "Word's going to spread about this, about what we can offer. We'll likely see more business. I can handle it. I know you can." He started to leave, then turned back. "The men have been talking about you, about how this place has changed since you got here." "Changed how?" "It feels less like a prison and more like a home." His voice was quiet, almost vulnerable. "That's because of you." Before she could respond, he walked away, and Lila stood alone in the yard with money in her hands and hope beginning to bloom in her chest. But that hope shattered 3 nights later when she woke to the smell of smoke. At first she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard shouting, men's voices, panicked and sharp, and she bolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. Fire. She threw on her boots and ran outside. The stable was engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, black smoke billowing into the night sky. Men were running from the bunkhouse, some still pulling on shirts, all of them converging on the burning building. But they weren't moving, they were just standing there, staring at the flames, waiting for Gabriel. Lila scanned the yard frantically and found him standing near the main house, his face white, his body rigid. He was staring at the fire with an expression of pure, primal terror. He wasn't moving. He couldn't move. "The horses!" someone shouted. "They're still inside." Lila didn't think. She ran toward the stable, her mind flashing to Margaret running into flames, to Gabriel frozen by his own failure, to the way fire could destroy everything in minutes. "Miss Hart, no!" Clay grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back. She wrenched free. "Those horses will die. The boss needs to. The boss can't." The words ripped out of her, raw and furious. She turned to the men clustered near the stable. "Stop standing around and help me. We need water. We need to get those doors open. We need to move now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Walker grabbed a bucket and ran for the well. Benson followed. Clay hesitated, then joined them. Lila ran to the stable doors, but the heat drove her back. The main entrance was impassable. She circled the building, coughing in the smoke, and found a smaller side door. The wood was hot to the touch, but not yet burning. She kicked it hard. Once, twice. On the third kick, it splintered. Mateo appeared beside her, his face covered with a wet cloth. He handed her another cloth already soaked, and together they forced the door open. The interior was hell. Smoke so thick she couldn't see 3 feet ahead. Heat that seared her lungs. The terrified screaming of trapped horses. Mateo grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, his knowledge of the stable guiding them through the chaos. The first stall. A bay gelding, wild-eyed and kicking. Mateo got the door open while Lila threw the wet cloth over the horse's eyes. The animal calmed just enough for Mateo to lead it toward the exit. Second stall. A mare with a white blaze. Lila's hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the latch, but she got it open and pulled the horse out. Third stall. Empty. Fourth stall. A young colt trapped in the back corner. The smoke was so thick now that Lila could barely breathe. She stumbled forward, her vision blurring, and felt Mateo's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Together they got the colt moving, but a beam crashed down behind them, sending up a shower of sparks. The colt panicked, rearing back, and its hoof caught Mateo across the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Lila screamed his name, or tried to, but her voice was gone, swallowed by smoke. She grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the door, the colt following instinctively now, and they burst out into the night air, gasping and coughing. The men pulled them away from the building. Someone threw water on Mateo's shoulder where his shirt was smoking. Lila collapsed onto her knees, her lungs burning, and watched the stable collapse in on itself, the roof caving with a roar that sounded like thunder. But the horses were safe. All of them, standing in the yard, their coats slick with sweat and soot, but alive. Lila looked up and saw Gabriel. He was standing exactly where she'd last seen him, tears streaming down his face, his expression broken. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying, and walked over to him. Her voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. "They're safe. All of them." Gabriel looked at her, and the shame in his eyes was so profound it was almost physical. I couldn't move. I saw the fire, and I was back there, and I couldn't. I know." Lila touched his arm gently. "But it's over. The horses are safe. Your people are safe. That's what matters." He shook his head. "You could have died. Mateo could have died because I was too much of a coward to—" "Stop." Her voice gained strength. "You're not a coward. You're human. You survived something terrible, and it left a mark. But your people still need you, so you need to pull yourself together and start acting like the man they think you are." Gabriel stared at her, and slowly, painfully slowly, she saw something shift in his face. The shame didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Resolve, maybe. Or just the recognition that he didn't have the luxury of falling apart. He straightened, wiped his face with his sleeve, and turned to address the men. "Everyone all right?" His voice was rough but steady. "Mateo's hurt, boss," Clay called out. Gabriel crossed the yard quickly, kneeling beside Mateo, where he sat propped against a fence post, his shoulder already swelling. "How bad?" Mateo shook his head and tried to wave him off, but Gabriel was insistent. "Walker, get him to the bunkhouse. Clean that wound and bind it. If it looks bad, we'll send for the doctor from Silver Creek." He stood and surveyed the ruins of the stable, his jaw tight. "We'll rebuild. Start planning tomorrow. For now, everyone get some rest. It's been a long night." The men dispersed slowly, exhausted and shaken. Gabriel turned back to Lila. "You saved them," he said quietly. "The horses. Maybe the whole ranch. You did what I couldn't. I did what needed doing, that's all. No, you did what I should have done." He paused. "Margaret ran into a fire to save horses, and I've spent 5 years thinking she was brave and I was a failure. But watching you tonight, I realized something. It's not about bravery. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. And you did that." Lila's legs suddenly felt weak. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her hollow and shaking. "I need to sit down." Gabriel caught her elbow, steadying her. "Come on, let's get you inside." He walked her back to the cookhouse, his hand supporting her weight, and when they reached her small room, he lit the lamp and helped her sit on the cot. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't think I can." He ran a hand through his hair. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the fire. Both fires. Then and now." Lila looked up at him, this man who'd been carrying his failure like a stone for 5 years, and made a decision. "Then sit with me until you can," she said. "You don't have to be alone with it." Gabriel hesitated, then pulled the wooden crate closer and sat down. They sat in silence, the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes, the distant sounds of the men settling down for the night filtering through the walls. After a while, Gabriel spoke. "Ruth was right about you. You do make this place better." "I just cook," Lila said. "No, you do a lot more than that." He met her eyes. "You remind us that there's still something worth saving here, worth fighting for." Lila didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She just sat with him in the lamplight, both of them carrying their ghosts, both of them surviving despite everything, and let the silence speak for itself. Eventually, Gabriel left, and Lila lay down fully clothed on the cot, too exhausted to do anything else. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames and smoke in the terrified eyes of the horses. She saw Mateo falling, saw the beam crash down, felt the heat scorching her lungs. She rose before dawn, her body aching in new and terrible ways, and started a fire in the cookhouse stove out of pure habit. Her hands moved automatically, measuring coffee, setting water to boil, while her mind stayed somewhere else entirely. The men came for breakfast looking haggard and hollow-eyed. No one had slept well. They ate in near silence, the usual morning banter replaced by exhaustion and the shared trauma of what they'd witnessed. Gabriel arrived last, shadows under his eyes, but his shoulders were back and his jaw was set. He'd made some kind of peace with himself during the night, or at least reached a truce. "After breakfast, I want Clay and Benson to ride into Silver Creek for lumber and supplies," he said. "We start rebuilding the stable today. Walker, you'll oversee the foundation work. I want it done right this time. Stone base, proper drainage. This ranch has burned enough." The men nodded, accepting their orders. "And someone check on Mateo," Gabriel added. "Make sure that shoulder's not worse than it looked last night." "I'll do it," Lila said quietly. Gabriel looked at her, seemed about to argue, then nodded. "After you're done here." She finished serving breakfast, cleaned the kitchen with mechanical precision, then crossed the yard to the bunkhouse. The morning sun was already hot, promising another scorching day, and the ruins of the stable smoked faintly in the light, a black skeleton against the blue sky. She knocked on the bunkhouse door. Walker opened it, his face brightening slightly when he saw her. "Come for Mateo?" he asked. "How is he?" "Hurting, but won't admit it. You know how he is." She did know. Lila entered the long, dim room lined with cots. Most of the men were already outside working, but Mateo sat on his bunk near the back, shirtless, his left shoulder wrapped in clean cloth that was already showing spots of blood. He looked up when she approached, and something complicated passed across his face. Relief, shame, gratitude, pain. "Let me see," Lila said, sitting beside him. He hesitated, then turned slightly so she could examine the bandaging. She unwrapped it carefully, and her stomach tightened at what she found beneath. The hoof had caught him at an angle, tearing a gash across his shoulder and down toward his collarbone. It had been cleaned and stitched, Walker's work probably, but it was deep and angry looking. "This needs proper attention," she said. "Gabriel's sending for the doctor." Mateo shook his head firmly and reached for his notepad with his good hand. He wrote, "No doctor. Will heal. You don't know that. It could get infected. I've had worse." She studied his face, saw the stubbornness there, and recognized it because she carried the same quality herself. "At least let me rebandage it properly, and you're not working today." He started to protest, but she cut him off with a look that would have made her mother proud. "That's not a request, Mateo. You saved those horses. You saved me. Now let me take care of you." Something in his expression softened. He set down the notepad and nodded. Lila worked carefully, cleaning the wound again with whiskey that made him hiss through his teeth, then applying a poultice she'd learned from her mother, herbs and honey to fight infection. She wrapped fresh bandages around his shoulder, her fingers gentle, and tried not to notice the way his skin felt warm under her hands or the way his breathing had changed. When she was done, she sat back. "There. Keep it clean and dry. Change the bandaging twice a day. And if it starts to look worse, you tell someone. Promise me." He picked up his notepad and wrote, "I promise. Thank you." Then, after a pause, he wrote something else and showed it to her. "You were very brave last night. So were you. I wasn't afraid. You were. I could tell, but you did it anyway." Lila's throat tightened. "How did you know I was afraid?" "Your hands were shaking, but you didn't stop." She looked down at her hands now, still marked with small burns and cuts from the night before. "My mother used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." Mateo reached out and touched her hand, not tentative this time, but deliberate. His palm was warm and calloused, and when she met his eyes, she saw something in them that made her heart stutter. "Mateo," she whispered. He withdrew his hand and wrote quickly, "I know this isn't the right time, but I need you to know that you matter to me, more than I know how to say." Lila's breath caught. She wanted to tell him that he mattered to her too, that his quiet gifts and steady presence had become something she relied on. that the thought of him being hurt had terrified her more than the fire itself. But before she could find the words, the bunkhouse door opened and Clay stuck his head in. "Miss Hart, boss wants to see you at the main house." The moment broke. Lila stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "Rest," she told Mateo. "I'll check on you later." She left before he could respond, her heart racing and her mind spinning. Gabriel was waiting on the porch of the main house, a large envelope in his hands. When Lila climbed the steps, he gestured for her to sit in one of the rough-hewn chairs. "How's Mateo?" he asked. "Hurt but stubborn. He'll heal if he doesn't do anything stupid." "Good." Gabriel sat across from her, the envelope resting on his knee. "I want to talk to you about something important." Lila's stomach tightened. After everything that had happened, she half expected him to tell her she was too much trouble, that the ranch couldn't afford the risk she represented. "All right," she said carefully. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "When Margaret died, I told myself I'd keep this place running for Samuel. Give him something to inherit, something to be proud of. Then Samuel died, and I didn't have a reason anymore. I just kept working because I didn't know what else to do." He paused, turning the envelope over in his hands. "Last night, watching that stable burn, I realized something. I've been so focused on what I've lost that I stopped seeing what I still have. This ranch, these men, a chance to build something that matters." He looked at her directly. "And you?" "Mr. Croston, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "You've been here 4 months. In that time, you've turned the cookhouse from a place the men tolerated into something that feels like home. You've worked harder than anyone should have to work. You saved my horses and probably saved me from myself in the process. And I've been paying you $20 a month like you're just another hired hand." He held out the envelope. "This is a contract, a partnership agreement. I'm offering you a stake in Iron Mesa, 10% ownership, a salary 3 times what you're making now, and a house of your own on the property. Not the room off the cookhouse, a real house. One of the old line shacks up on the ridge could be fixed up proper, with a kitchen and a bedroom and a view of the valley." Lila stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because this ranch needs you. Because I need someone I can trust to help me run this place the right way. Because you've earned it." He set the envelope on the table between them. "Ruth wrote to me again after she got home. She said I needed to stop trying to do everything alone. Said Margaret would have been furious with me for being so stubborn. She was right. I can't run this place by myself, and I don't want to anymore." Lila picked up the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a legal document, dense with formal language, but the key terms were clear. Partnership. Ownership. A future. "This is too much," she said. "It's what's fair." "I'm just a cook." "No." Gabriel's voice was firm. "You're not just anything. You're the person who walked out of the desert with nothing and built a place for yourself through sheer determination. You're the person who ran into a burning building when I couldn't. You're the person who makes grown men ask for seconds on biscuits, and who's been quietly holding this ranch together while I figured out how to be human again." Tears pricked at Lila's eyes. She looked down at the document, at her name written there in formal script, and thought about her mother saying that the dead don't want us to stop living. "I accept," she whispered. Gabriel's face broke into a smile, genuine and warm and transforming. "Good. We'll ride up to the line shack this afternoon so you can see it. It needs work, but it's solid. And Lila?" He paused. "Thank you for everything." After their conversation, Lila walked back across the yard in a daze. Partnership, ownership, a house of her own. It felt surreal, like something from a dream she might wake from at any moment. She found the men already at work on the stable ruins, clearing debris and laying out the foundation for the new structure. They worked with purpose now, no longer paralyzed by what had been lost, focused instead on what could be built. Mateo sat on a bench near the corral, his injured shoulder carefully immobilized, but his good hand was busy braiding leather strips into a halter. When he saw her approaching, he set down his work. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Gabriel just offered me a partnership. Ownership stake in the ranch." Mateo's eyes widened. He grabbed his notepad and wrote, "That's wonderful. You deserve it." "I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm grateful for it." "You deserve everything good that happens to you." Lila looked at him, at this man who'd been leaving gifts on her doorstep since her first week, who'd worked beside her without complaint, who'd run into fire with her because she'd asked. "Mateo, What you wrote earlier, in the bunkhouse. He tensed slightly, waiting. I need you to know that you matter to me too, more than I've let myself admit. She took a breath. I've spent so long just surviving that I forgot what it feels like to care about someone, to want someone to be safe and happy. But I feel that way about you. Mateo's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, and when he met her eyes, there was joy there, pure and unguarded. He reached for his notepad with his free hand and wrote, May I court you properly? Lila smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Yes, but only if you promise to rest that shoulder and not do anything reckless. I promise to try. That's not a promise. It's the best you'll get from me. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound felt strange and wonderful. Mateo squeezed her hand gently, and they sat together watching the men work, planning a future neither of them had expected to have. That afternoon, Gabriel took Lila up to see the line shack. They rode on horseback. Lila on a gentle mare, Gabriel on a rangy gelding, following a trail that wound up through pine forest and opened onto a ridge with a view that stole her breath. The line shack sat in a clearing surrounded by aspens, their leaves shimmering silver in the breeze. It was small but well built, with good bones and a stone chimney. Gabriel dismounted and helped her down, then pushed open the door. Inside was a single large room with a loft above, a fireplace against one wall, and windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. The floor was dusty, and there were signs of neglect, cobwebs in the corners, a loose shutter, but Lila could see the potential immediately. It needs cleaning, Gabriel said. New windows, probably. The roof might need patching, but the structure is sound. Lila walked through the space, her mind already transforming it. A kitchen area near the fireplace. A table by the window where she could read her mother's journal and Margaret's recipes. Room for her cast-iron skillet and her spices and all the small treasures she'd accumulated. There's a spring about 50 yards that way, Gabriel continued, pointing. Good clean water year-round, and the soil here is decent. You could have a garden if you wanted. Vegetables, herbs, whatever you need. It's perfect, Lila said softly. Gabriel smiled. I thought you might like it. I'll have the men start fixing it up next week, after the stable's underway. Should be ready for you by autumn. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. When they reached the yard, Lila found Mateo waiting near the cookhouse, his face anxious until he saw she was safe. She smiled at him, and the relief in his expression made her chest ache. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. The men worked on the stable during the day while Lila continued her duties in the cookhouse, but now there was a different energy to the place. People smiled more. There was laughter during meals. Even Gabriel seemed lighter, more present, engaging in conversation instead of eating in stiff silence. True to his word, Gabriel had a crew start on the line shack. Clay and Benson replaced the windows and patched the roof. Walker built a sturdy table and bench. Mateo, working one-handed but determined, crafted a set of shelves for her books and supplies. And through it all, Lila and Mateo grew closer. He continued to leave her small gifts, wildflowers tucked into her apron pocket, a smooth river stone left on her windowsill, once a perfectly carved wooden spoon. She cooked his favorite meals and saved him the best portions and learned to read the subtle expressions that crossed his face since he couldn't voice them. One evening, as they sat together on the bench outside the cookhouse watching the stars emerge, Mateo wrote something in his notepad and showed it to her. I wish I could tell you properly how I feel, with words. You do tell me, Lila said softly, every day, just not with spoken words. It's not the same. Maybe not, but it's enough. She took his hand. You show me you care through everything you do. That's more honest than 1,000 pretty speeches. He looked at her for a long moment, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead, gentle, reverent, full of everything he couldn't say. Lila closed her eyes and let herself feel it, the safety, the tenderness, the sense that maybe, finally, she'd found a place where she belonged. By mid-September, both the stable and the line shack were complete. The stable stood strong and solid, built with stone foundations that wouldn't burn. The horses had been returned to proper stalls, and Gabriel had already purchased 2 new breeding mares to expand the herd. The line shack, Lila's house now, had been transformed. Clean windows let in abundant light. The fireplace drew perfectly. The shelves held her mother's journal and Margaret's recipe book side by side, along with the leather pouch of spices that had carried her through the desert. The cast iron skillet had a place of honor hanging near the stove. On the day she officially moved in, the entire ranch came to help. The men carried her few possessions up the trail: the cot, the wooden crate, a trunk Gabriel had given her for storage. Mateo brought the chili plant, now thriving in a larger pot, and set it beside the door where it would get morning sun. Gabriel arrived last, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He set it on the new table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a wooden sign carved with simple lettering: Lila Hart, partner, Iron Mesa Ranch. "For your door," he said. Lila's vision blurred. "Thank you for all of this. Thank you for staying, for fighting for this place when I couldn't." Gabriel glanced around at the assembled men. "I think we all know things were pretty dark around here for a while, but they're not dark anymore. And that's because of you." Clay cleared his throat. "Boss is right. You made this place feel like somewhere worth staying." "Damn good biscuits, too," Benson added, and everyone laughed. They stayed for a meal, Lila's first in her new home. She'd prepared stew and cornbread that morning, knowing this moment was coming, and they ate crowded around the table and spilling out onto the porch, talking and joking like a family. As the sun set and the men started heading back down to the ranch, Mateo lingered. He helped Lila clean up, moving around her kitchen with the ease of someone who'd worked beside her for months. When they were done, he pulled out his notepad and wrote, "Would you like company, or do you need time alone?" Lila looked at this man who'd become so essential to her life, who'd helped her build this place into a home, and knew exactly what she wanted. "Stay," she said. "Please." They sat together on the porch as darkness fell and the stars emerged, brilliant and infinite above them. Mateo had his good arm around her shoulders, and Lila leaned into his warmth, feeling more content than she'd been in years. "I never thought I'd have this," she said quietly. "A home. People who care about me. A future." Mateo reached for his notepad and wrote by moonlight, "I never thought I'd find someone like you." "What happened to you, Mateo? What made you stop speaking?" He was quiet for a long time, and Lila thought he might not answer. But then he started writing, page after page, and handed them to her one at a time. "I came from Mexico. Small village in the mountains. Had a family, mother, father, 2 sisters. We had a small farm, good land, happy life. Raiders came, took everything, killed my father, my mother and sisters." He paused, the pencil trembling. "I tried to stop them. They beat me, left me for dead. When I woke, my throat was damaged. Couldn't make sounds, couldn't speak, couldn't even scream. I buried my family, walked north, didn't know where I was going, just knew I couldn't stay. Gabriel found me on the road 2 years ago, half dead, starving. He brought me here, gave me work, gave me a reason to keep living. Then you came, and you gave me hope." Lila's tears fell onto the pages, blurring the ink. She set them down carefully and turned to Mateo, taking his face in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for what you lost, for what was done to you." He touched her cheek, wiping away her tears, and she saw understanding in his eyes. He knew she carried her own losses, her own scars. "We're both survivors," she said, "both people who kept walking when we should have given up. Maybe that's why we found each other." Mateo nodded, then leaned forward and kissed her, properly this time, with all the words he couldn't speak pouring through the gesture. Lila kissed him back, tasting salt and hope and the promise of healing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mateo wrote one more thing. "I love you." "I love you too," Lila said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Autumn came to Iron Mesa with its usual spectacular beauty. Aspens turning gold, crisp mornings and warm afternoons, the smell of wood smoke and turning earth. The ranch settled into its winter preparations, and Lila found a rhythm between her work in the main cookhouse and her time at her own home on the ridge. Mateo's shoulder healed slowly but surely, and he returned to his work with the horses. But now, instead of sleeping in the bunkhouse, he spent most nights at Lila's house, and no one seemed surprised or concerned. Some things didn't need explaining. In late October, a letter arrived from Ruth Cross. Gabriel read it in the main house, then brought it to show Lila. She wants to visit again, he said, for Thanksgiving. Says she wants to see the improvements to the ranch. And? Lila prompted, sensing there was more. Gabriel smiled slightly. And she wants to meet the woman who's been writing her about my recovery. Apparently you two have been corresponding? Lila felt her cheeks warm. She sent me a letter after she left, asking how you were doing. I wrote back. It seemed only kind to keep her informed. Kind. Gabriel shook his head, but his expression was fond. You've been conspiring with my aunt. Not conspiring, just sharing information. Well, she's coming for Thanksgiving. Think you can handle cooking for that? I can handle anything, Lila said with confidence that wasn't false modesty. It was earned. Ruth Cross arrived on a cold November morning, her carriage rattling into the yard with characteristic authority. But when she stepped down and saw Gabriel waiting for her, something in her face softened immediately. Nephew, she said, embracing him, you look well. I am well, Gabriel said. And it was true. The haunted look that had defined him for so long had faded, replaced by something calmer, more settled. Ruth turned to Lila, who'd come down from the ridge to greet her. Miss Hart, or should I say Partner Hart? Lila is fine, ma'am. Then you must call me Ruth. She took Lila's hands in hers, squeezing gently. Thank you for the letters, for the updates, for taking care of him when I couldn't. He takes care of himself now, Lila said. I just cook. You do considerably more than that, and we both know it. Ruth glanced around the yard, taking in the new stable, the busy men, the sense of purpose that permeated the place. This ranch feels alive again. That's your doing. Thanksgiving dinner was a production that required 2 full days of preparation. Lila cooked in both her house and the main cookhouse, with Mateo and several of the men helping. They roasted 3 turkeys, baked pies from dried apples and the last of the summer berries, made stuffing with sage from the garden, and prepared enough side dishes to feed 20 people. The meal was served in the main house, around a table extended with boards and covered with mismatched tablecloths. Gabriel sat at the head with Ruth beside him. Lila and Mateo sat together, his hand finding hers under the table. The ranch hands filled the remaining seats, dressed in their cleanest shirts, slightly awkward, but genuinely happy. Before they ate, Gabriel stood. I'm not much for speeches, he began, but I want to say something. 5 years ago, I lost my wife and son. I thought that was the end of everything that mattered. For a long time, I was just going through the motions, working because I didn't know what else to do. He paused, his gaze moving around the table. But this year I've learned something important. Family isn't just blood. It's the people you choose to stand beside. The people who work with you and believe in you and refuse to let you give up on yourself. His eyes settled on Lila. Some of you came here because you needed work, others because you had nowhere else to go. But you stayed because this place became home. And that's because of the woman who walked out of the desert with a skillet and a dream of survival and turned it into something more. Lila felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Gabriel raised his glass. To family, to second chances, to the people who save us even when we don't deserve it. To family, everyone echoed, and the meal began. They ate for hours, the conversation flowing easily, punctuated by laughter and the comfortable silences of people who knew each other well. Ruth told stories about Gabriel as a boy that made him blush and everyone else laugh. Clay demonstrated his card tricks. Benson sang an old trail song in a surprisingly good baritone. And Mateo, emboldened by the warmth and acceptance around him, pulled out his notepad and wrote something he passed around the table. It read, "Grateful for this place, for all of you. For Lila, who taught me that home is something you build together." When the note reached Lila, she looked at him with eyes full of love, and he smiled. That rare, beautiful smile that transformed his entire face. After dinner, as the men were clearing dishes and Ruth was helping Gabriel organize leftovers, Lila slipped outside for air. The night was cold and clear, the stars impossibly bright. She heard footsteps and turned to find Ruth approaching, wrapped in the green shawl she'd given Lila months ago. "You're wearing it," Lila said, surprised. "I am. You gave it back to me in one of your letters, said it should stay in the family." Ruth stood beside her, gazing out at the valley. "That was presumptuous of you, sending it back as if you weren't family yourself." "I didn't want to presume—" "Lila." Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. You are family. You've earned that place through everything you've done, and I'm grateful for it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This was Margaret's, her grandmother's before that. Gabriel gave it to her when they married. She opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring set with a small sapphire. He asked me to give it to you. Lila's breath caught. Ruth, I can't. It's not a proposal. Not yet, anyway. Ruth smiled. It's an acknowledgement of what you mean to this ranch, to Gabriel, to all of us. Margaret would want you to have it. She took Lila's hand and pressed the box into her palm. You brought this family back from the dead, Lila Hart. That's worth more than gold or land or any contract. That's worth everything. Lila clutched the box, unable to speak through the emotion clogging her throat. Ruth embraced her briefly, then returned to the house, leaving Lila alone with the stars and the weight of a legacy she'd never expected to inherit. When she went back inside, she found Mateo waiting. He saw the box in her hand, raised an eyebrow in question. Lila showed him the ring. From Margaret. Through Ruth. Through Gabriel. Mateo wrote, It's beautiful. It's a promise, Lila said, that I belong here, that this is real. It is real. We are real. She slipped the ring onto her right hand, not her wedding finger, not yet, but a place of honor nonetheless. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Winter came to Iron Mesa with snow and wind and long, dark nights, but the ranch weathered it well. The new stable kept the horses safe and warm. The cookhouse stayed busy, feeding men who worked shorter days but still needed hot meals and comfort against the cold. And up on the ridge, in the line shack that had become a home, Lila and Mateo built a life together. They cooked side by side, he chopping vegetables with his now healed shoulder while she tended the stove. They read by firelight, her mother's journal and Margaret's recipe book spread between them, adding their own notes in the margins. They planted seeds in pots on the windowsill, preparing for the spring garden they'd cultivate together. On Christmas Eve, Gabriel and Ruth came up to the house with the entire ranch crew, and they shared a meal that Lila had spent days preparing. The little house was packed to bursting, warm with body heat and laughter, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread. After dinner, as people were starting to drift toward sleep or departure, Gabriel pulled Lila aside. I have something for you, he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a deed. Not for a portion of the ranch. She already had that. This was for the line shack and the 20 acres surrounding it, transferred entirely into her name. It's yours, Gabriel said, completely. No matter what happens to the ranch, no matter what the future brings, this land is yours. You've earned it. Lila looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Gabriel, you saved me, he said simply. When I was drowning in grief and couldn't see a way forward, you threw me a rope. This is inadequate repayment, but it's what I can give. She embraced him then, this man who'd been a stranger 6 months ago and had become something like a brother. Thank you. For everything. Thank you for staying, for not giving up on us. As the celebration wound down and people began the journey back to the main ranch, Mateo pulled Lila outside onto the porch. The night was cold but clear. The valley spread below them like a blanket of diamonds where snow caught the moonlight. He pulled out his notepad and wrote by lantern light, I know we haven't been together long, and I know I can't give you pretty words or promises spoken out loud. Lila's heart began to race. But I can give you my whole heart, my loyalty, my protection, everything I am and everything I have. He turned the page. Will you marry me? Lila looked at this man who'd left gifts on her doorstep, who'd run into fire beside her, who'd shown her through 1,000 wordless gestures what love could look like when it was real and earned and true. Yes, she said, 1,000 times yes. Mateo's face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen from him. He pulled a small cloth bundle from his pocket and unwrapped it to reveal a ring he'd made himself, woven from horsehair and inlaid with small pieces of turquoise he'd traded for in Silver Creek. He slipped it onto her left hand, and Lila wore both rings now. Margaret's on her right as a symbol of belonging, Mateo's on her left as a promise of forever. They married in the spring, when the aspens were budding green and the valley was carpeted with wildflowers. The ceremony was simple, held in the yard at Iron Mesa with Gabriel officiating. He'd ridden to Silver Creek specifically to get the authorization. Ruth stood as witness, tears streaming down her face. The ranch hands attended in their Sunday best, grinning and elbowing each other. Lila wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, cream-colored with lace at the collar, and carried wildflowers Mateo had picked that morning. Mateo wore a new shirt Ruth had given him and looked more nervous than she'd ever seen him. When Gabriel asked if they agreed to join their lives together, Mateo held up a sign he'd prepared. I do. And Lila, her voice steady and sure, said, I do. They sealed the marriage with a kiss that made the cowboys whistle and Ruth dab at her eyes, and then everyone moved to the cookhouse for a feast that Lila and several of the ranch women had prepared over the past 2 days. There was music, Benson on fiddle, another hand on harmonica, and dancing that went on until the stars came out. Gabriel danced with Ruth, laughing in a way Lila had never seen. Clay tried to teach Walker how to waltz and nearly got stepped on, and Lila danced with Mateo, his good arm around her waist, moving slowly under the Montana sky. I love you, she whispered against his chest. He couldn't respond in words, but she felt his arms tighten around her, felt the way his heart beat steady and strong, and knew he was saying the same thing back. That night, they returned to their house on the ridge. Their house now, officially and completely. Mateo carried her over the threshold, a tradition he'd learned from Gabriel, and set her down gently in the center of the room they'd built together. Lila looked around at the life they'd created from nothing, at the shelves holding recipe books and memories, at the cast-iron skillet hanging beside the stove, at the chili plant, now grown large and productive, sitting beside the door, at the seeds they'd planted in the garden that were just beginning to push through the soil. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, starving, desperate, dragging herself through the desert with nothing but a skillet and a prayer. She thought about her mother and Margaret and all the women who'd come before her, teaching her through their recipes and their words that survival wasn't enough, that you had to build something worth surviving for. And she realized she'd done exactly that. She'd taken her grief and her fear and her cast-iron skillet, and she'd built a home. She'd found a family. She'd discovered love in a place that had forgotten what love looked like. She'd survived. And then she'd learned to live. Mateo touched her face gently, asking without words if she was all right. Lila smiled and kissed him, tasting their future in that gesture. All the meals they'd cooked together, all the quiet evenings, all the challenges they'd face and overcome side by side. I'm more than all right, she said. I'm home. And in the house on the ridge at Iron Mesa Ranch, with her husband's arms around her and the smell of growing things drifting through the open window, Lila Hart finally understood what her mother had meant all those years ago. The secret wasn't in the recipe. It was in the care you put into it. It was in the love you built, one meal, one gesture, one choice at a time. It was in refusing to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only option left. And it was in knowing that sometimes the most broken places and the most broken people could come together and create something whole, something beautiful, something worth fighting for, something worth living for, something called home.